Welcome to Human Rights Matters, where we discuss matters of human rights because your rights matter. The last podcast I did was on implicit bias in policing, and it provided a psychological perspective and tried to explain why it's so difficult or has been so difficult in changing um, the way police operate. This week, we're going to discuss again recruitment, training, and the issue of reform using the implicit bias perspective as a backdrop. In that video, we saw that implicit bias impacts a lot of different areas across law enforcement. We can see how it impacts the use of force, how it impacts the application of law, how it impacts community engagement, how it impacts reform as we're speaking about it. And actually, we're not talking about reform. What we're talking about is public safety versus law enforcement. And so therefore, we're talking more about transformation of law enforcement rather than reform. In our minds, reform is a way that we change or tweak a process or system. Transformation is turning something into something else. And if we're talking about turning law enforcement, turning away from law enforcement into more of a public safety issue, then we're starting to touch on transformation rather than reform. So today we're joined again by Mike Brown, Lee James, Kerry Watson, and Maurice Davis. So I want to start on the recruitment issue. And how do you see this issue of implicit bias impacting our recruiting, and what do we need to put in place to sort of mitigate that issue? And who wants to start off?
I'll start. Everybody have biases, no matter what. That everybody has some type of bias, and certainly for people who are either hiring managers or recruiters, should recognize that they have biases, and to recognize when your bias comes up, basis versus what's factual. And I think that requires us to make sure that these folks who have the responsibility to screen and hire people, that they completely understand the subject and the topic of implicit bias, and that they are aware of their own biases, reviewing a candidate's application, interviewing a candidate, and that will go a long way, because some people just don't know about implicit bias. And when you don't know something, it can override the facts. And so we just need to make sure that when it comes to recruiting, hiring, that our folks are educated on implicit bias.
You know, as Mo was,
sum it up real quick. The key is awareness and education.
As Mo was speaking, it brought me back to when I was applying to the police department. And, you know, they used to give you this big giant book where you had to, I assume they probably still do, you had to fill it out. It took forever to do. They interviewed seemingly everyone you knew, everybody in your neighborhood, you know, old teachers. And they bring you in and they talk to you. And it's almost an interrogation in a sense, where they're asking you your background, the things that you've done, the things that you've done illegal, if you've stolen anything. And they put me through as they did probably with you all, through a polygraph lie detector test. And I'd never used, excuse me, I'd never used marijuana before in my life. And I'd explained that to them. I'd been around it, but I'd never used it. I took the test. They said that I failed the question on marijuana. So literally it was like a television interrogation. I'm sitting in a room, two older white men standing over me with one light in my face, telling me that you're telling me you went to Largo High School and you played in go-go bands growing up and you never used marijuana? Sir, I never have. I had the opportunity, I just didn't. And it went back and forth like this. And the bias piece is they made an assumption that because I went to Largo High School and played in go-go bands and did those things that I had to have. But in a twisted way, it really forces me, or forced me, a 21-year-old me, to think, oh, well, everybody like me must be like that, and that's why. So when I hit the street, I, they planted a seed that I am the person that I'm looking for.
Mm.
It's really kind of twisted.
So it sounds like one person's twisted implicit bias can actually have long-standing effects on somebody else.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very good point. What I was thinking about, Reggie, was the fact that, and I think I mentioned this, I don't think we do a good job when it comes to the psychological and behavioral assessment pieces of the recruiting process. I think most law enforcement agencies, they don't delve into this area of implicit bias. And let's just be honest, because implicit bias just became, I would say, within the last 10 years, 5 to 10 years, became a concept that has just gotten a lot of attention, recently. So, when I came on the police department back in the early 80s, there wasn't any talk about implicit bias, so to speak. And I think about the number of people that came on in the classes after me as they were being recruited. How deeply did the psychological aspect of recruitment play when it came to that? So I think that police departments today need to make more of an investment, and it sort of mirrors what Mo was saying, need to make more of an investment in the psychological aspects and behavioral assessments around implicit bias, and really trying to flush out what that really, because we all have them. How do we do this job at a higher level, knowing that we have biases? Right. And then knowing that this job is about interacting with people. And so you're going to meet people from, the lowest rungs in life to the highest rungs in life. And you're going to interact with them in most of the time, it's going to be in crisis situations. How do you not let your biases overtake you and actually misjudge people and misjudge situations?
Michael, I want you to answer the question as well, but I want to add this piece onto it. Now we're talking about, implicit bias and how it impacts recruiting. When you see implicit bias training going on, what's the core underlying objective when they do that training?
The core underlying objective is for you to understand that we all have biases and how to address those biases. But I think one of the issues with the training is acceptance. It's easy to say we all have biases, and I understand that, you understand that, but some people still refuse to acknowledge that they have biases. And going back to the original question, we tend to gravitate those who look like us. So is that a bias, or is that human nature? And if so, once you determine that, then how do you put that into the applicant and recruiting process? And going back to what Carrie said, I think we should eliminate the polygraph altogether. I think we should rely more on the psychological exam, because at 21, we didn't know that the polygraph doesn't really detect deception. It's a tool that the investigator uses to do like they did to Carrie, solicit information that the machine can't pick up. And how many folks were denied, especially of color, employment because of the zip code they live in and that quote unquote marijuana question?
So if we're acknowledging that everybody has biases, and to your point, it's part of human nature, but there's something that we have to do, because the things that we're seeing today is a direct result of sort of a disparity in the way laws are applied and treatment that's meted out based on the area that you live in. So how do we start mitigating this issue where you're treated differently because of where your zip code is?
So Reggie, you just said a word the word is law. And that made me think of the judicial system. When African Americans go before a white judge, we don't look like him or her.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we gravitate toward those that look like us. So when this black male or female is before this white judge, he or she don't look like that judge. So there's no, in my opinion, there's no, you lose a sense of sympathy, so to speak, because it's harder to sympathize with something that's different than us.
So then it
It's
goes
so
back,
interesting.
so then it sort of goes back to, I think, what Lee was saying, or Mo, about addressing awareness and education throughout the entire criminal justice system. The next question is, would an educational program or some other form of training to address those gaps be beneficial? I mean, I know you're saying that a lot of folks don't accept the fact that they have these implicit biases built in. So how do we sort of overcome that to start changing the behavior about how the police interact with minority communities?
Reggie, I think that the training program would be good, but it would have to be intense. Intense meaning just like Kerry shared with us just a moment ago about his situation with marijuana, to the people actually put themselves out there, talk about their biases in a group, have it be okay to talk about your bias, because that will make people begin to feel comfortable with their bias, recognize it, and realize that it's not out of the norm to have a bias. So it would take a skillful instruction. It would take somebody that makes the space open and free without judgment, and so that you can really dig into a person's bias, talk about it completely, and have it be, private and okay.
Hey,
Because most people don't like to think that they have a bias.
Reggie, I think, and I want to piggyback on what Moses is talking about. I mean, now we're moving into the area of not just addressing training around implicit bias for law enforcement officers, but for all members of the criminal justice system. And so if you're going to have implicit bias training for police officers, I think across the board, you got to have some sort of implicit bias training for everybody that's within the criminal justice system. To me, it just makes sense that we would be held, as you always hear, to a higher standard. And as part of that, I think, not only implicit bias training, but with other trainings as well, we have to basically raise our game.
What does this new training system look like?
You're talking about being held to a higher standard, and I concur. We do. That also requires the public to invest in the work and in the people, and be dedicated, not judgmental to the point where, you're just looking at the mistakes that they make, but understanding that mistakes are made when you don't invest the way that you should. So it kind of leads to the training. Yeah. You still want to pay as little as possible for the talent. So you're only going to get so much talent. And then once you get those people in, you only want to pay a limited amount to get them trained and prepared. And the only way I see that you truly cure it is, it's almost like the 12-step program when you're an alcoholic. First, you got to recognize you have a problem. And then I think you have to be engaged with the people who you think you don't understand, who you don't understand. You think you understand, but you don't. And realize that they're not as different from you as you think they are.
How is that reflected in our training program then? What are we talking about, specific training methodology?
Reggie, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike. No, please, Mike, go.
So Reggie, training is a tool. I said from the first podcast that this is about leadership. And let me give you an example. So I sat in a class on sexual harassment where a sergeant said, and I quote, "Women are the apple of my eye, and I don't see why I can't tell them that." So that wasn't addressed with the sergeant. After the class, he went on about his life. So that tool isn't useful to him. Leadership was there. They saw it, did nothing about it. So how do you expect that behavior to change? and you can translate that right into implicit bias. It's the same thing.
Well, doesn't this go to training of leadership as well?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So Reggie, I see exactly what Mike is saying, but this is why I said it has to be intensive and probably not related to, not out of the police department. A couple of things. Number one is when you talk about training, most of the government training we get is just like Kerry said, is basically cheap training. We do it with the least amount of money and least amount of effort. If we're really interested in changing people and how they think and how they relate and creating a new paradigm. You asked early on about transformation versus reform. I feel that we need total transformation of the police departments. And total transformation means that we do something that we have not done before. We think out of the box, we start to act. And one of those things are the kind of trainings that we have. Again, intensive training. And when you select a candidate, or when you don't select a candidate, it should be reviewed by a group of people. So if I come to you guys and let's say that we're all on the same recruiting team, and I said, well, I rejected this candidate for such and such, such and such. The process ought to be fair enough so that you can grill me, question me, to make sure that I didn't make that decision based on some bias that I have. And a system of checks and balances, rather than say, oh yeah, we know Mo, Mo's a good guy. No, Mo, you rejected this person. Explain to us exactly why you rejected him. And if it doesn't correlate with something else, another person that you rejected for the same, or you didn't reject, who had the same indicators. That's how intense the training is. It's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be quick. It's going to be time consuming. But I think the more people who have a responsibility understand that their decisions are subject to be scrutinized, I think things will start to change. Yeah. So the training should look like a check and balance process. It should be intensive, and it should be led probably by somebody other than the department that you're in, professionals.
We talked a bit about situational and environmental threats, how the officer views the neighborhood that they're working in. I think I mentioned earlier, there is this program, at least, I don't know if it's still continuing in Chicago, My Block, My City, My Hood, where, I mean, kids were taking officers, from the Chicago Police Academy and taking them through the neighborhood and having given them a bit of information about the area that they're going to be policing and the places that those students call home. I mean, is that something you think is beneficial for an academy class, I mean, across the board?
Yeah, it is, but understand it has its limitations in the sense that Kerry mentioned that some biases are good biases. If I'm working in a gang area where we know that gangs exist, and I see the signs and the indicators, then my bias should tell me that this is probably what this person's up to, or this is probably based on the fact that he is flashing gang signs. His tattoos indicate that he's part of the gang, and the people that he's associated with. That's a bias, but it's a good bias
But doesn't that go outside of the issue? Because when we're talking about bias, we're talking about when your own personal beliefs, recognized or unrecognized, basically infringes on the rights of somebody else. I mean, if you have a set of criteria that's objective enough that you can identify somebody that's engaged in illegal activity, I don't know if I'd label it as a bias, but it's when we have these, like I said, recognized or unrecognized perceptions of another group that we then start using our authority in a way that basically doesn't ensure equality of treatment under the law.
Biases are most impactful at the lower level because that's where situations happen that cause leadership to it causes leadership nightmares. And so, just as Kerry says, if I never smoked marijuana in my life, then I make an assumption that everybody doesn't smoke marijuana, or that I have a bias that people who smoke marijuana, there's something wrong with them. That is a bias.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I would agree. In Kerry's case, you have Kerry doesn't know how to read a polygraph, so he could have said he was telling the truth. He didn't know. But the trick was, you're a black kid going to Largo High School. We know that, probably the majority of kids or that's the assumption. But because of the environment that you were in, you should have been expected to be involved in this activity.
Yeah.
And that then, it's
so how do I treat you? How do I treat
an assumption based on no fact.
Right. How do I treat you then?
Well, that's
right.
The thing.
I would argue that the problem isn't necessarily the bias, even though obviously the bias is an issue. It's how you act upon that bias that's the problem. It's the action that occurs as a result of having the bias that we have to address. And so to go back to your question, again, I think it's immersion. It's nice to have a program where you walk somebody through a neighborhood for a day, but I don't know that has that doesn't have the impact that you really want. You have to be immersed in a community to understand that people are not bad by nature necessarily, that there are bad people within communities, but it doesn't make an entire community bad. And without immersion, and it can't be in an adversarial way. Once you put that badge and a gun on, they see you as an adversary. And I would argue that some of our training forces us to look at them as adversaries. But when you don't have that badge or that gun, and you know that the people that you're with are really trying to teach you and make you a better person, and you can open yourself up to that and be immersed in a community, you will treat that community differently, not as evil, not as an adversary, not as dangerous, not as ugly, but identify the fact that the community and the individuals within it that are bad are two different things.
Yeah. I think that this is, what Kerry just talked about is really a great opportunity for, one of the things we've been hearing, especially now when people are talking about defund the police and reform and, all of this stuff, this is a great, because I do believe that at least in the United States, you're going to see police departments have more involvement from the community in their operations, in their training. Because to me, that's what the community is asking for. We want more of a say-so in how these officers are trained and how they operate, because they operate in our community. They operate, they operate with our kids. They operate, we are the recipient of services of the police. So why shouldn't we be a part of educating the police? So I think this is a great opportunity for that to occur. But I want to go back to also one of the things that Mo said, because he took some of the words right out of my mouth. When he was talking about transformation and reform, when you're talking about, in my mind, when we talk about transforming, we're talking about changing the paradigm. And I think in American policing, that's where we are. And I'll tell you why. Because for the last X number of years, 20, 30, 40 years, we've been talking about reform. Reform is fixing the problem. But transforming is moving to a new paradigm and delivering better service. I'll give you a business example. Yesterday, I had an opportunity to go to a bank. And this bank is like the bank that you see on TV being advertised now. Our typical bank, when you walk into the lobby and you look at the tellers are behind a set of plexiglass windows. That's what we see. That's what we've been seeing for years. And there's a reason for that. However, the bank that I went into yesterday, plexiglass windows were a thing of the past. Now you have a cafe style, customer oriented. These people, at least 3 people greeted me at the door as I walked in. And I felt welcome. They wanted to know, how can we help you? And it was a good experience. Policing has to move in that sort of direction. Policing has always been very traditional about the way we've done things. However, now the society is saying, hey, look, since we are the ones being policed, we are the recipient of your service that you have sworn an oath to serve and protect. We're the recipient of service. We're demanding better customer service. Get to know us. Let us get to know you. This is beyond community policing. Just like Kerry was talking about, this is immersion into that society, into the knowing the people. I felt yesterday after that experience, I felt like these people really want to get to know who I am. Of course, you know, there's a bottom line, and the bottom line is, you know, whatever money I can bring to that bank. But the service that I got made me feel like I want to be there. And that's the sort of paradigm that law enforcement has to adopt going forward.
My favorite word, one word, over the last couple months, evolve. We have to be willing to evolve as people, as human beings, and we have to allow people the opportunity to evolve. We have to let people change and become better. We have to suggest and almost demand that police agencies evolve and change with us. And somehow evolution has become a bad word. Like if you're changing, then you must have been wrong, or you must have done something wrong. Well, you know what? No, we can all become better. Let's evolve together. Let's talk about it. Mm-hmm. How do we evolve? Well, change is kind of a bad word. People are scared of it. Let's talk about evolving.
I mean, I'm hearing you guys saying that this is a two-way street, right? How do you bridge that gap with what the community think they need and how police have traditionally done their jobs? So I agree there needs to be this kind of a communication that's going on. But when we're talking about immersion, are we talking immersion, you know, hey, you know, I'm in the police academy for 6 months. I'm going to make, you know, X number of hours throughout that time that we go into these neighborhoods and talk to folks and see what's going on. Part of the reform packages that are coming out now, you know, we want officers to live in the neighborhood. When we start talking about this whole transformation, you know, issue, I mean, what is it that we actually asking, or what is it that we actually, you know, talking about? No, you know, I know the issue about, you know, living in the neighborhood or visiting the neighborhood is, I think for me, it's a concern, you know, based on the experience I had, you know, a lot of years ago, you know, taking my son to a McDonald's in a neighborhood that I policed, and it didn't go well. You know, I ended up leaving, you know, before it was time, you know. But I mean, there's actual, I think in these instances, if you're living in a community that you're policing, is inevitably you're going to probably run into undesirable elements. So we've got to be realistic about what we're asking as well. But how do we go about, because we're talking about changing basically the tasks that we've traditionally done. What does that look like? How do we shift?
Well, I think one of the ways that you do shift is, again, you have to ask the community, what is it that you want? You know, most people want peace. They want tranquility. They want a livable community. They want to be able to thrive in their community. How does police facilitate that? That's what's important. They want, you know, when people look at us, they look at us as the law and order people, the people that take care, the people that they call when they have a crisis, when they have a problem. How do we fit into that? Because crisis will occur. However, you know, crisis occurs quickly. Most of the time, society is moving along. The livable community, the other things are going on, everyday living. So we have to ask the community. We have to be more open to listening and then putting into action, you know, things that will work in the community. So I think, you know, asking the community to be more a part, and that's what I think that's what you're going to see come out of this. When we get out of this place where we are right now with law enforcement under the microscope, I think those police departments, and there are going to be a few, they're not going to be, it may not be many, but there are going to be a few police departments that you're going to see that are more in tune with their communities because they've listened to the community and they've adopted the community, the things that the community wants. And I again say that's going to be more involvement from the community in the police department. Now, again, It's not an overnight thing. I mean, you know, we didn't get here overnight, so certainly that's not going to happen overnight. Can't be.
I think I'm hearing something, and I'm not quite sure that I can put it into, you know, the words that I want. But it seems like what we're saying, or what I'm
Dr.
hearing,
Braxton, you're the man.
what I'm hearing is that we want to be more service oriented rather than enforcement driven. We want, but we can't quite figure out how to make that switch from sort of the police department has a function and a job, and we want to find ways that the community can help us solve these crimes that we're seeing, rather than engaging the community beforehand to prevent those crimes from occurring in the first place.
Yeah, so I see it as what Lee is saying. I see it as a trust factor. The community has to trust police leadership. And how do you do that? Number one, you engage the community, even if it takes small sections at a time. You build your trust back by doing what you said you were going to do, and you make sure the community knows that certain things are out of bounds. When it comes to gunplay, when it comes to certain things, we are going to enforce. But short of that, we'll negotiate, we'll talk about it, we'll make sure that you know who we are, we'll attend your church, go to your church services, we'll go to your community services, we'll be a part of your neighborhood cookouts, whatever we need to be a part of. But we agree that these are the things that we're gonna not use heavy-handed enforcement, but we're gonna enforce. And these are the things that we can talk about.
I have to agree with some things that were said.
Well, hold on. Let me say this, Mike, so you can address it.
Okay.
I think what I'm hearing Mo is saying, I think it's a bit contradictory to what Lee was saying, because you're still police driven about what we will and won't do, and I think Lee's talking about community driven about what we expect from the police. So in your instance, I think it sort of sounds like we're going to dictate the things, the terms of the engagement, right? Here's the things that we're going to put up with. Here's the things that we're not going to put up with. And that's how I'm hearing it. So Mike, jump in and say,
if you're talking about Mr. and Mrs. Lamb, murder, rape, sodomy, those kinds of things, if you don't enforce them, regardless of what the community says, you're not in law enforcement.
No, that's what I'm saying. We're being crime driven, right? If we're talking about transformation and we're being crime driven, we're always going to be in an enforcement mode. And so then are we willing now to hold our breath and take that leap and engage the community beforehand to try to prevent those things from happening? So we don't have, 5, 6 murders on your block. I mean, they're happening within the community. They're the ones with the information. They know who the people in the neighborhood are, that are doing, the crimes. So that's what I'm saying.
Well, if Billy Bob is running down the street with a gun in his hand, in the middle of the community, I don't think many people in the community would say, "Oh no, police, we don't want you to." They want enforcement. They want you to do something about that.
Right, but that relationship is made beforehand, because if Billy gets away, you wouldn't want somebody in the community to call you up and say, "Hey, officer, the guy that was running down the street with a gun was Billy, and he lives the next place, and this is what he's involved in." So again, it goes to part of what you're saying, that there's got to be a trust factor. So there's got to be some way that you got to anonymize the people that are calling in, giving you information. There's got to have to be that trust factor.
Sure.
But I don't know that if you want to transform, that you can continue, the police department can continue to dictate the pace about how we work on crime.
The reason things haven't changed is because the leadership, again, don't want to change. We just had a governor had her life threatened or kidnap threat in the state of Michigan, and a law enforcement leader is on YouTube supporting the Proud Boys, justifying their actions. We all watch YouTube. We see these law enforcement leaders that, for obvious reasons I won't name, but we know that if leaders don't change, it's not going to change at the bottom. So that goes to something that Mo said about the impact of implicit bias being at the bottom level. I disagree. We all worked, well, the three of us worked on it in an agency where the culture dictated what we did and what we didn't do. And that
I,
culture came from the top.
I don't disagree with that, Mike, at all. But what I'm saying to you, the impact can be clearly seen at the lower
Right.
level.
Yeah, it could be seen at the bottom level. Absolutely. But it started at the top. It's the top that let us know that what we were doing was okay.
Yeah, there's a tolerance.
Let me offer something that
the top makes the policy, and the bottom you see the result of that policy.
Right.
So I'm gonna offer something that you all have heard me mention before. Number one, everybody remembers sticks and stones will break your bones. I think there's been no better example than the last 4 years where we've seen that words actually do matter. And it's how you communicate, it's the things that you say that set a tone that everybody else kind of responds to, number one. Number two, you all have heard me mention, you've read my writings on it, that law enforcement, I don't know if that is the mission that we should be undertaking, that our goal is safety for communities. So you hear public safety and law enforcement, the words interchangeably. I think that we really need to focus on public safety and not law enforcement. Mm-hmm. Now, enforcement of the laws may be part of keeping a community safe, but I don't know that law enforcement should be our first and foremost goal. Mm-hmm. It is the safety of the public. So that's a different attitude. Law enforcement says you see someone driving down the street with a broken out taillight, you write a ticket enforcing the law. Public safety says you see somebody driving down the street with a broken out taillight, you let them know that their taillight is broken and help them find a way to get it fixed. That is safety, and that's where we should be focused. Mm-hmm. And it starts from the very top. There, as you've heard me mention, there's an incentive program that officers respond to that causes negative interactions with the public. That's what has to change. And as long as it's about enforcing laws, putting people in jail, giving people tickets, having negative interactions with the public, the things that we're seeing aren't going to change. They haven't changed in the 30 years that I've been paying attention, and more than 30 years, and it's not going to change tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Because the mission hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. The goals haven't changed. The incentives, the motivations that I was 21 when I started on the police department. The incentives are get a better job, get a better position, get a promotion, get more money. Well, the way you do that is you do what the company tells you to do, what the organization tells you to do. And if what they're telling you to do is enforce the law, that is what you're going to do to get ahead. And the interactions with the public will never change. Mm-hmm. We have to be safety minded. We have to be public safety officials to make it a better community, a safer community, one that we can engage in a cordial and peaceful manner. But that's not the job right now.
So that goes back to the whole issue we started off with, was reform versus transformation. And so we've got to come up with at least how we get the mission statement changed, right? How do we move from this enforcement to the issue of safety and service? And I think that's the tricky part, because I don't think that a lot of within the law enforcement community we know how to make that switch.
Mm-hmm. It's a switch. It's a complete switch, and the challenges that I've had in continuing to say the same thing over and over again is at some point people have to stop thinking about the job the way it used to be. It is a true evolution. It is a change. It is a transformation, as you said. We can't think of policing as law enforcement anymore. Start from where you want to end up, a safe public safety. And how do you get there? Mm-hmm. And that's not all the time enforcing the law. Mm-hmm. That should only be part of it, and not even the first part of it. It's not even the most important part of it as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. Keeping people safe is the most important part.
Right. Reggie, how do we get there? The method is in the message. So 2 law enforcement leaders, one, I go to his webpage, and the first thing you see is the SWAT team, armored personnel carriers, et cetera, et cetera. Another law enforcement leader. His wife happens to be a Spanish teacher at a college. And I say to him, hey, why don't you have a Spanish version of your website, which he did. So two different agencies, two different methods with two different messages.
All right.
I think also, Reggie, I think, first of all, kudos to Kerry, because the public safety model is actually the model that police departments should be, for lack of a better term, modeling going into the future. And there are many examples of that. If you look at a lot of universities, even, in the healthcare environment, the officers that work in those environments are looked at as more of a public safety entity as opposed to a policing entity. However, when the need arises for crises and for crisis intervention, for example, the active shooter situation, or the person that has committed a sexual assault, when those things arise, that public safety force has to be able to shift into their law enforcement mode and be able to manage those things. That's the expectation. But 99% of the time, the safety of the public is what should be at hand. And there are many examples out there of successful, I know for me, where I've worked in the university arena, there are many public safety examples. When I went to Howard University, I remember I changed the name of the police department to the Department of Public Safety. Mm-hmm. It engenders more of a service-oriented entity in concert with what the community wants. And that's what police departments have got to do.
I agree, because I think one of the most visible examples of what we're talking about here is traffic enforcement. Now, if we're safety focused, we put a cruiser visible on the side of the road, probably lights, flashing while they're sitting there, which would sort of mitigate the traffic speed. Instead, what do we see? A hidden cruiser running radar to catch you speeding, mm-hmm. Right? And so I think this is a classic example of enforcement versus safety. What are we focused on? And I guess it sort of has to be sort of a deeper examination of who benefits from the enforcement. Because if we're so willing, if we're so reluctant to make that change, and I would suspect that probably part of that is revenue driven, we've got to start looking at what is the incentive to maintain this model that we've been arguing against.
There's no community policing in a speed camera.
So based on our video from our last video and the discussion we've had today, bias is a naturally occurring cognitive process. So the question becomes, how do we mitigate it? How do we address the issues raised by implicit bias in recruits or training within law enforcement? And to mitigate it, part of it may be through training, but more strides would probably be made through an understanding of the community, immersion within the community that's being served. Second, reform alone is insufficient. Tweaking the current system may not provide the outcomes that is being sought. True community engagement and input is necessary in deciding how to make our community safe. There must be a change in focus from enforcement to public safety. Although law enforcement will be a part or a task used to make our community safe. So these issues that are being raised, they are not one-sided. They're complex and multiple issues occurring at once. And so problems may not be solved in the short term. And agencies and agency leaders have to be courageous leaders and take at least some risk in trying to decide how do we move away from our current policing model to something that's more sustainable and more customer friendly or community friendly.